Okay, so we're going to start this series now, Gods of War, and I recognize that as we start a 6-week series on false gods, that most people probably think we don't need to spend 6 minutes on that. They kind of look at it and say, really, false gods, this is going to be an important series. The reality is that the idea of idolatry and false gods takes up an awful lot of the Bible. The very first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. God made that number one for a reason. We've talked about how God wants to be first in our life and things, but this is specific to idolatry and gods. And when I was telling people, I was kind of trying to get people excited about the series. Hey, we're going to be doing this series. It's going to be on false gods and idolatry. And they're like, I thought we were a modern church. It's like, that's like 1000 BC stuff, right? What are you doing, Pastor? What are we, the Mayans now or the Aztecs? Well, I don't have any little tiny golden idols in my house. I'm good there. I want to move on to something more modern and more relevant. And if you think about it, we don't really even have much talk about this in our culture unless, maybe some kind of obscure movie reference that's actually more played for laughs than the real thing.
I don't see how I can.
These guys come from legend. They're basically gods.
There's only one god, man. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't dress like that.
Like my second favorite line of that movie. There's only one God and he doesn't dress like that. But anyway, that's kind of how we talk about gods. There's this weird comic book sort of thing. It's not really part of our life, right? And in the olden days, of course, and when I say olden days, we're talking about the Romans who basically, spread civilization with their roads throughout the kingdoms. Gods were very common, and they're just upfront and open about it. Your family would probably have sworn allegiance to a god, and you'd be expected to do that too. If you had something specific in your life you needed, you'd go to that temple and you'd, donate money to that god, depending on what you're doing. And they had gods for everything in Roman culture. In fact, one of the scriptures in Acts, some of you may know, Paul goes to this place called Mars Hill, and they had an altar to every god they knew of. And there's like all these idols and altars all around. And at the very end, just in case they missed one, they had an altar to the unknown God. And Paul walked there and says, this is the God you need to know about. And he used that as a spring-off point to preach one of his best sermons about the unknown God and why they needed to know him. But that was then, and this is now. And we don't have that anymore. And the reality is we do. It's just we've become a lot more sophisticated about it. So I'm going to give an analogy that's going to be weird, but go with me for a second. This is a famous quote about poker. I don't know if you can read it down here. The guy who invented poker was bright, but the guy who invented the chip was a genius. That was a poker player said that. And what he means by that is, the chip allows us to abstract our money from what we're gambling with. And that allows you to take chances that you would never take if you were taking your money out of your pocket and putting it on the table. You would just never do that. But because they invented that chip, it was plastic. And it actually means different things at different times in a tournament and things. So this layer of abstraction, which is abstraction, the art of considering something in terms of general qualities instead of actual or concrete realities, is what we have become very good at. So we take things and we kind of abstract them to the point where it doesn't mean that anymore. And so what we end up with is we kind of end up with a list of things, qualities. But what we haven't done is gotten away from the idea of worshiping other things. In fact, Paul, in one of his last letters alive before he was killed, was writing to Timothy, and he says this, preach the word, for the time will come when they won't endure sound doctrine. He's talking about us, by the way. But according to their own desires, they're going to heap up for themselves teachers. They'll find their own people, and they will turn their ears away from the truth, and they'll be turned aside to fables. And so Paul even then was seeing, look, there's going to come a time when we're going to get peeled off from truth, and we're going to start following fables. But we don't really call them even fables, right? What we do is we kind of have turned all of this into this big, massive list of good and evil. And what we consider good and what we consider evil depends on where we fall on the list. Let me give you an example of that. When my father was in college, smoking was becoming very strong on college campus. And he was on the track team, and he kind of hung out with the other people on the track team, and their captain smoked. I know it seems strange today, but it was very common back then. Athletes would come off the field and light up a cigarette. And they would always have to wait for him to finish his cigarette. And my father would get on him about that, saying, why is this smoking thing? It's just stupid. You should get rid of it. And this guy said, you don't understand. I'm addicted. And my father said, no, you don't understand. You just have bad willpower. See, they had this list in their head, and on there, smoking fell. But depending on who was talking about it, fell in a different place. See, this guy, it was his addiction. And so it was right in the middle. And my father was above smoking. So to him, it was evil. It was bad, right? But to that guy, it wasn't bad. It was just something he did and couldn't stop doing. Well, what happens, but this guy told my father, if you smoke for 2 weeks, you couldn't quit. And they made a bet, a $20 bet, that my father could smoke for 2 weeks and then quit. My father then smoked for the next 30 years of his life. Couldn't quit. And he probably fell out a little bit down on that list then too. All of a sudden, smoking, And so when it's on your list, and we do have these things, which even if we're doing them and they're kind of part of us, there's something about us that, boy, we don't like this. And so we bring that to God. And we say, here's a list of things, and when we get saved, here's a list of things I would like you to help me with. These are the things on my list that are bad, and I know they're bad. A lot of them are beneath me, and I don't struggle with those. But some of these I'm struggling with, and I need your help getting rid of these. See, but everything on our list, you have to understand, somebody else has either above or below, depending on where they fall on the list. See, if you're hooked on smoking and you're an alcoholic, smoking's not so bad to you. But if you're an alcoholic and you're also hooked on cocaine, alcoholism's not so bad. I mean, you can function as a drunk, but it's hard as a cocaine addict. If you're hooked on cocaine, tar heroin's bad. And you can go down that list forever. Depending on where you are on a list, depends on how you think about things. But you can also walk up the list and do the same thing. Things that we think are good, like, for instance, we don't want help with these guys because these are good. Faith or family. I love my family. There's nothing wrong with loving my family. There's nothing wrong with loving my country. Patriotism's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with, loving my church and my religion. But what we have to understand is that, I talked about how people fall on that list. God's at the top of the list. And he's telling us, you don't understand. Your whole list is bad. Well, wait a minute. How can loving your family be bad? I don't know. Charles Manson loved his family. How can loving your country be bad? Hitler loved his country. And don't even get me started on how religion can be bad and how people can do things in the name of religion. It doesn't matter what's on our list. It's all bad. And that's what God says. He says, listen, we are as unclean, an unclean thing, and all of our righteousness is filthy rags. This is from Isaiah, and Paul quotes it later. So he's saying, no, it's all bad. But when we look at that list, and we look at what God's telling us, we say, okay, I kind of hear this, sort of like the woman in the chair thing, but there are just some things I just don't want to give up right now. And whenever there's something in your life that's true of, you have to understand you are dealing with an idol. You're dealing with a false god that you have put your trust in. There's some reason why you won't give that up. It's like, I'm sorry, God, I just can't do this. And it's partially because you don't trust God, but it's also partially because there's something about this thing, this idol, this ideal even, that you think's good and makes you better. And God's saying, no, I am the only thing that's good, and I am the only thing that can make you better. And so this is where we find this in Corinthians. He says, look, certain things become our examples. To the intent that we lust after evil things. And it said, do not become idolaters. This was all throughout the Bible. Paul was talking about this in Corinthians. So what am I saying then? That an idol is a certain thing? No. Rather, the things which they sacrifice, they actually sacrifice to demons and not to God. So if you are sacrificing for something, anything, doesn't matter a certain thing, as we're saying here, anything you've put in front of God. And it can happen really very subtly, because this is what we call seduction in our world, but it's also called deception in the Bible. Because what happens is you get started on this because it's good. It's a good thing. And I'm going to do this good thing, and before you know it, it becomes your main thing. And it can happen anything. It can happen even to the church. And this is something that I'm going to be honest with you, I've struggled with since we've started Spirit Chapel. And well, how in the world could Spirit Chapel become a false god? Because this place is here to worship God. But anything I put in my life before the God has to go. I have to understand that as we started Spirit Chapel, that this was done for the pleasure of God. And if he says, Mark, I'm done with Spirit Chapel now, I don't need it anymore, I have to say, okay, Lord. And that's a hard thing to do when you put your blood, sweat, and tears into something, I'll tell you. It's very, very hard. And so you start working for something for a good cause, and God even calls you forth to do it. And you start getting caught up in it, and before you know it, it becomes what's driving you instead of God. Last week we talked about Abraham and Isaac and how Abraham finally got the gift from God, and Isaac was a gift from God. But God came back and says, well, do you like the gift more than the giver? Really? Let's test that. Because God's always testing our heart in this. And when we first started Spirit Chapel, I went around and I spoke with all kinds of pastors, just about anybody. We went to just about every church in the area, and most of them were very similar. There were a couple of them that we walked out of saying, don't make eye contact, just keep moving quickly. Come on, you guys have been those too. But most of the churches were very sincere, good people who were worshiping God their way. But if you've been around the different churches, you've seen the dwindling population in the churches on Sunday morning. And so I would oftentimes try to meet with the pastor of the church to get his take on it and say, what's going on in your, congregation and in your neighborhood, and what are you doing about it? And I had some interesting conversations. Many pastors wouldn't meet with me. Some did. And I was having a really good talk with this one pastor who was a pastor of a denominational church, and it was still doing fairly well, but its numbers had dwindled. And we were talking about this subject, and this is a book that I had recently read called Comeback Churches, and this guy wrote his doctorate thesis on 300 churches they studied from all different kinds who turned themselves around and what made it happen. And he had read a book similar to that, and we were talking about this, and we're discussing what it takes to make a church relevant to society today and things. And he said in the book that he read, the conclusion of it was that in order for this turnaround to happen, which by the way is much harder than what we're doing. It's harder to turn around a church than start a church. He said what makes a turnaround necessary and possible is if the pastor for a period of 5 years will put the church first in his life. That was kind of the conclusion of all the pastors there. And when we're just talking, and again, we're just kind of talking, two guys talking on a very intellectual level, suddenly it became very passionate. And he leaned forward and he said this to me: I was not called to put the church in front of my family. And he got red in the face and he kind of leaned into me, which surprised me. It kind of almost like invaded my space. He said it again, really strongly. Like I had told him to do this and he was telling me, no, I didn't tell him to do that. And I walked out there a little bit confused by it wasn't confrontation. We finished up pleasantly and everything else, but I was praying about it. I said, God, that was weird, And God said, I told him to do it. He wasn't talking to you. He was talking to me. And I said, well, I was getting ready to start a church and becoming a pastor. Wait a minute. Are you telling me that's what you're telling me too? He says, no, I never said this. I said this. The call is to put God before everything. And if you put God before everything and you trust him, everything falls into place. And this is the thing that we have to remember, and something that I have forgotten sometimes here in Spirit Chapel. And, I've apologized to my family and to the people who've worked with me for this sometimes. God has to come first, and he takes care of the rest. Because you have to believe the fact that you know who God is. I kind of got into some trouble last week when I asked a question that I didn't answer. I do this apparently. I've done this before. I asked the question, is God a monster? And I never came back really to answer it. Someone got mad at me for that. But we have to remember about God. And we have to remember who he is in relationship to our life here. And sometimes we think we're doing pretty well and we're bringing God along. Have you seen the bumper sticker, God is my co-pilot? I'm the pilot, but God, you can sit in the co-pilot seat, and I'll drive you around. We're going to invite God to join our lives. Come on, God, come on. I'm doing great. You're going to love this. I have a great life. Wait till you see it. And every now and then, when I need help, I want you to help out. But basically, God, come and join my life because I've got this. And God's saying, no, you don't. You don't understand. you're not really in control like you think you are. You're about to get smashed to smithereens by life, and you need my help. And that's why you need me there, not in the co-pilot seat. You need me in the pilot seat. And I was thinking about this, and do you remember, this is an old movie, but there was a movie years ago, Romancing the Stone. Some of you guys have probably seen it on TV. But it's Kathleen Turner's this romance novelist who ends up in this adventure of a lifetime by mistake almost, and she ends up in the wilds of this jungle. And she was on this bus that gets crashed, and she gets off the bus, and she doesn't even know where she is. There's no cell phones, no nothing. She's just completely lost. And she runs into a character played by Michael Douglas, who's an American, thank God, because she didn't speak the language. And he speaks English. And he had lived there in the bush, in the brush, for several years and kind of become acclimated, so he knew all about the jungles that they were sitting on. And she realized her only hope out of that jungle was to get him to guide her, and she ends up having to pay him. But he takes over in some ways that make her uncomfortable.
My minimum price for taking a stranded woman to a telephone is $400.
Will you take $375 in traveler's checks?
American Express?
Of course.
Got a deal. You're gonna lose a lot more than that.
These were Italian.
Now they're practical.
See, the thing is that when he took over for all of it, and she wasn't in control, and she recognized that. And so even when he does something that's really uncomfortable for her, chopping up her Italian shoes, he's doing it because this is the only way she's going to make it through this jungle. You may not like it, but he knew better than she did how to get out of that jungle. And that's what God's trying to tell us. He says, I want to be the Lord of your life, not so I can ruin it. I want to be the Lord of your life so I can run it. And what we have to understand is, since God loves us, it's okay to give him control. When I was praying about that after my meeting with that pastor, I said, wait a minute, are you going to tell me that you're going to want me to put the church in front of my wife? He said, Mark, I love Victoria more than you do. You think I would do that to her? I've got her. I've got Emily. I've got Stas. I've got your whole family. And I can take care of them better than you can. What you need to do is listen to me, and I'll take care of all of that. And you have to trust him on that. So it's not that I'm putting God in front of my family, I'm putting him first. And he loves my family, and he loves everything else in my life that he put there. And I have to trust that he takes care of that. Now, there have been times, that I've been working on the church, and I've heard God's voice say, what are you doing? What are you doing with that? You got family right now that needs you. And so if you're open to God's leading and you hear his word, you can trust this. It's okay. And that's the only way we're going to get out of this jungle alive. Jeremiah says this, for I know the plans I have for you. This is God speaking. They are plans of peace and not evil, to give you a future and a hope. That's God's plan for you. That's what he says. Put me in charge, I'll make this happen. You don't put me in charge and you just call me when you need me. You're going to have a roller coaster ride with a lot of bumps and bruises. Put me in charge. So that's what this series is all about. Choose. Choose. Who's going to be in charge of your life? Would you all pray with me right now?